The dust-laden wind carried the sound of a woman's desperate pleas down Main Street as Sheriff Victor Rawlings dragged her by a length of rough rope bound around her wrists. Delilah Hayes stumbled behind the lawman, her once fine blue dress now torn and smeared with the dirt of Belmont, Wyoming territory. It was 1878, and the promise of frontier justice had never looked so cruel. "I didn't steal anything," Delilah cried, her voice hoarse from hours of protesting. "Please, Sheriff, this is a mistake." The sheriff yanked the rope harder, causing her to trip and scrape her knees on the rough-hewn boardwalk. "Save your breath, Miss Hayes. 3 witnesses saw you take that money from the bank counter. In Belmont, we don't tolerate thieves, especially not ones who try to use their pretty faces to escape punishment." The townsfolk of Belmont gathered along the street, some with expressions of disgust, others with pity in their eyes. No one stepped forward to help. No one except the lone figure leaning against the post outside the saloon. Isaac Harrington had arrived in Belmont only yesterday, riding in from the Montana Territory with dust on his boots and ghosts in his eyes. The tall cowboy straightened as the sheriff's procession passed, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip. "What's her crime?" Isaac called out, his voice steady despite the growing tension. Sheriff Rawlings paused, turning to face the stranger. "None of your concern, cowboy. Move along." Isaac stepped into the street, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. His eyes caught Delilah's eyes, as blue as the Wyoming sky and just as deep. In that moment, something passed between them, a connection neither could explain. "I asked you a question, Sheriff," Isaac said, his voice dropping an octave. "What's the lady's crime?" "Theft from the bank. Now stand aside or I'll have a cell ready for you too." Isaac studied the woman carefully. Her wrists were raw from the rope, and despite her disheveled appearance, there was a dignity in her stance that spoke of innocence. "You've got the wrong person," Isaac said with certainty, though he had no way of knowing. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "I won't tell you again. This is Belmont business." "Untie her," Isaac said, his voice barely above a whisper, "or I'll burn this place down." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. The crowd fell silent, watching the confrontation unfold with bated breath. Sheriff Rawlings' face darkened with anger. "You're making a big mistake, stranger," he growled. "Wouldn't be my first," Isaac replied, not backing down. "But arresting an innocent woman might be yours." The sheriff's deputy, a nervous young man named Emmett, stepped forward. "Sheriff, maybe we should hear her out properly. There's been some confusion lately with all the newcomers in town." For a long moment, Sheriff Rawlings seemed to weigh his options, looking from Isaac to the gathering crowd. Finally, he grunted, "Fine, we'll take her back to the jail for questioning. But you," he jabbed a finger at Isaac, "stay out of it if you know what's good for you." "I'll be along shortly," Isaac replied, ignoring the warning, "just to make sure justice is properly served." As the sheriff led Delilah away, she turned back to look at Isaac, her expression a mixture of gratitude and fear. Something about those eyes made Isaac's chest tighten. He'd come to Belmont looking for work, not trouble, and certainly not to play hero to a woman he'd never met. Yet here he was, about to walk into the lion's den for her. Isaac waited until they disappeared into the jailhouse before heading to the saloon. He needed information, and in a town like Belmont, the saloon was where secrets flowed as freely as the whiskey. Inside, the air hung heavy with tobacco smoke and piano music. Isaac made his way to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and listened. It didn't take long before he heard what he needed. "That Hayes woman's been nothing but trouble since she inherited Old Man Fletcher's boarding house," a miner was saying to his companion. "Sheriff's sweet on her property, if you ask me. Fletcher left it to her fair and square," another patron argued. "She worked for him for 3 years, cared for him when he was dying. The old man had no family, she was the closest thing to it. That still don't explain the missing money, the first man countered. Isaac downed his whiskey and approached the men. What's this about missing money? The men eyed him suspiciously before the second one spoke. $500 disappeared from the bank counter this morning. Sheriff says he has witnesses who saw Miss Hayes take it, but he shrugged. Timing's mighty convenient with the property taxes due tomorrow. And if she can't pay? Isaac asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sheriff's brother-in-law gets first claim on foreclosed properties. The man leaned in closer. Been happening a lot lately. Good folks losing their homes over crimes that no one quite saw happen. Isaac nodded his thanks and left the saloon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery hues that matched his mood. He'd seen corrupt officials before, had fought against injustice during the war and after it. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get involved again, wouldn't risk losing more than he already had. But something about Delilah Hayes had broken through that resolve. The jailhouse was a squat stone building at the end of Main Street. Isaac pushed through the door to find Sheriff Rawlings behind a desk, while Delilah sat handcuffed to a chair in the corner. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. "I thought I told you to stay out of this," the sheriff growled, rising from his chair. "Just making sure everything's above board," Isaac replied, casually resting his hand on his gun. "Heard some interesting talk in town about property taxes and foreclosures." The sheriff's face flushed. "You do well to mind your own business, stranger. The name's Isaac Harrington, and I'm making this my business." He turned to Delilah. "Miss Hayes, is there anyone who can vouch for your whereabouts this morning?" Before she could answer, the sheriff slammed his hand on the desk. "This isn't a public hearing. I was at my boarding house all morning," Delilah said quickly. "Mrs. Abernathy and her daughter were there. They're staying in the front room. They saw me." Isaac nodded. "Where can I find them?" "You'll do no such thing," the sheriff interjected. "Actually, he will," came a voice from the doorway. A tall man in a tailored suit entered, holding a leather briefcase. "Daniel Prescott, Miss Hayes's attorney. I'll be representing her in this matter, and I believe Mr. Harrington is assisting with the investigation." The sheriff's face turned even redder. "There's no investigation. We have witnesses." "So you say," Prescott interrupted, "but I find it curious that none of these witnesses have provided sworn statements. And more curious still that this arrest comes just one day before Miss Hayes's property taxes are due." Isaac watched the exchange with interest. The lawyer's arrival complicated matters, but perhaps in their favor. He caught Delilah's eye and gave her a small nod of reassurance. "Sheriff," Prescott continued, "unless you're prepared to file formal charges with evidence beyond hearsay, I suggest you release my client immediately." For a moment, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Sheriff Rawlings spat on the floor and reached for his keys. "Fine, but this isn't over, Miss Hayes. The money's still missing, and you're still my prime suspect." As he unlocked Delilah's handcuffs, Isaac moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. The sheriff noticed and smirked. "Your cowboy friend won't always be around to protect you." Delilah rubbed her wrists as she stood. "I don't need protection, Sheriff. I need justice. And if you continue this harassment, you'll find yourself explaining your actions to the territorial judge." Outside, the evening air felt cool against Delilah's skin. She turned to Isaac and Prescott, gratitude shining in her eyes despite her exhaustion. "Thank you both. I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't mention it," Isaac cut in. "But you might not be safe yet. Do you have somewhere you can stay tonight besides your boarding house?" "She can stay with my wife and me," Prescott offered. "Clara would welcome the company, and it would be prudent to have witnesses around her at all times until this matter is resolved. Delilah hesitated. The boarding house. I can't leave it unattended. And I need to be there to collect the rents tomorrow for the taxes. I'll stay there, Isaac said before he could think better of it. Keep an eye on things overnight. Prescott looked at him appraisingly. You're taking quite an interest in a stranger's welfare, Mr. Harrington. Let's just say I've seen enough innocent people railroaded by men with badges. Isaac met Delilah's gaze. Besides, something tells me Miss Hayes is worth the trouble. A faint blush colored Delilah's cheeks. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I offered. Isaac adjusted his hat. Lead the way. I'd like to speak with your tenants anyway, especially the Abernethys. As they walked through town toward the boarding house, Delilah explained her situation. Charles Fletcher left me the boarding house when he died last year. It was unexpected. I'd only been working for him as a housekeeper. But he had no family, and he said I'd brought life back to the place. She sighed. The sheriff's been trying to get his hands on it ever since. The building sits on land that's become valuable since they announced the railroad spur will pass nearby. And the missing money? Isaac asked. I've never even seen it. I was at the bank this morning to deposit rent payments, not to withdraw funds. The teller, Mr. Collins, can confirm that. But he's the sheriff's cousin, so. She trailed off, the implication clear. The boarding house came into view, a two-story structure with a wide porch and fresh white paint. It stood on a corner lot, larger than most buildings in Belmont. It's beautiful, Isaac commented. It's home, Delilah replied simply. The only real one I've had since my parents died. Inside, the boarding house was well maintained and clean. A middle-aged woman looked up from her needlework when they entered. Miss Hayes, we heard what happened. Is everything all right? She asked, setting aside her work. For now, Mrs. Abernathy, Delilah replied. This is Mr. Harrington. He helped me with the sheriff and has some questions for you. While Delilah went to check on her other tenants, Isaac spoke with Mrs. Abernathy and her daughter Sarah. Both confirmed without hesitation that Delilah had been at the boarding house all morning, preparing rooms and cooking breakfast for the boarders. She never left until nearly noon, Mrs. Abernathy insisted. Sheriff Rawlings is a scoundrel for suggesting otherwise. Would you be willing to make a sworn statement to that effect? Isaac asked. Gladly, the woman replied firmly. Miss Hayes is a good Christian woman. She doesn't deserve this persecution. After speaking with the other tenants, all of whom corroborated Delilah's whereabouts, Isaac found her in the kitchen, preparing tea with shaking hands. Your alibi seems solid, he said, leaning against the doorframe. But the sheriff won't give up easily, especially if there's land involved. Delilah nodded, handing him a cup. Why are you helping me, Mr. Harrington? You don't know me. Isaac considered the question as he accepted the tea. I've been riding from town to town for 3 years, Miss Hayes. After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere. Seen too much, I suppose. He took a sip before continuing. When I saw the sheriff dragging you through town like that, it reminded me why I fought in the first place. For people who couldn't fight for themselves. I can fight my own battles, she said softly, but without reproach. I've been doing it since I was 16. I don't doubt that. But sometimes even the strongest fighters need allies. He set down his cup. I'll take the parlor sofa tonight. Tomorrow we'll get to the bottom of this missing money business. Delilah looked like she wanted to protest, but then nodded. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Isaac, he corrected. If I'm sleeping on your sofa, you might as well use my given name. A small smile touched her lips. Delilah, then. Isaac took first watch while Delilah retired to her room upstairs. The boarding house settled into quiet, with only the occasional creak of the building responding to the cooling night air. He sat by the window, watching the street outside, his thoughts turning over the day's events. Something wasn't adding up. If Sheriff Rawlings wanted the property, why make such a public spectacle of arresting Delilah? It would have been more effective to quietly pressure her until she couldn't pay the taxes. Unless the display itself served a purpose, perhaps to discredit her in the eyes of the town. Around midnight, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Isaac was on his feet instantly, gun drawn. He moved swiftly through the darkened house, following the noise to the kitchen at the back. The window was broken, and a flaming bottle had been thrown inside. "Fire!" Isaac shouted, rushing to stamp out the flames that were already spreading across the wooden floor. "Everyone out now!" The boarding house erupted into activity as tenants emerged from their rooms in various states of undress. Isaac directed them to the front door while battling the blaze with a wet tablecloth. Delilah appeared beside him, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a bucket of water. She threw it onto the flames without hesitation. "The well's out back," she said, already moving toward the rear door. "No!" Isaac grabbed her arm. "Whoever did this might still be out there." As if to confirm his words, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Delilah's head. Isaac pulled her down behind the kitchen table, shielding her with his body. "Is there another way out?" he whispered. "The cellar has an exit that leads to the alley," she replied, her breath warm against his neck. Isaac nodded. "Let's get the fire under control first. Stay low." Working together, they managed to extinguish the flames before they could spread beyond the kitchen. The damage was contained, but the message was clear: someone wanted Delilah out, one way or another. Once the immediate danger had passed, Isaac checked on the tenants, who had gathered in the street. Mrs. Abernathy was organizing them, ensuring everyone was accounted for. "We need to report this to the sheriff," one of the male boarders insisted. "And what if the sheriff ordered it?" Isaac countered. He looked at the frightened faces around him. "Does anyone have somewhere else to stay tonight?" There were nods and murmurs as neighbors who had come to investigate offered rooms. Soon only Delilah, Isaac, and the Abernathy's remained. "We're not leaving you," Mrs. Abernathy declared, her daughter nodding in agreement beside her. "Safety in numbers." Delilah seemed about to argue but then relented. "Thank you. We'll take turns keeping watch." Back inside, they secured the broken window as best they could and moved to the parlor at the front of the house. Isaac insisted on taking the first watch while the women tried to rest. Delilah, however, couldn't sleep. She joined Isaac by the window instead. "Who would do this?" she whispered, wrapping a shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Burn down a house with innocent people inside?" "Someone desperate," Isaac replied, "or someone who thinks they're above the law." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the moon-dappled street. "You said you fought in the war," Delilah ventured at last. "Which side?" "Union," Isaac answered. "Joined up in '63 when I was 18. Fought until Appomattox." He didn't elaborate on what came after the years of wandering, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. "What about you? How did you end up in Belmont?" Delilah sighed. "I came west after my parents died of fever in '70. I was 19, had a little money saved, and a cousin in Cheyenne who said there were opportunities for women out here." She gave a sad smile. "The opportunities weren't what I'd hoped, but I managed to find respectable work. Eventually ended up here as Mr. Fletcher's housekeeper. And now you own a boarding house that's sitting on valuable land," Isaac concluded, "which makes you a target." "I never wanted trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted a home." The vulnerability in her voice stirred something in Isaac's chest. He'd been rootless for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it meant to belong somewhere. Looking at Delilah now, her face illuminated by moonlight, he found himself wanting to protect not just her, but what she represented, a chance at something permanent. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Morning brought a flurry of activity. Delilah's tenants returned to collect their belongings, most deciding to find other accommodations until the situation was resolved. Mrs. Abernathy and her daughter, however, stubbornly refused to leave. "We're witnesses to your character, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Abernathy stated firmly. "And we pay our rent on time, which means we're staying." With the rent money collected and safely stored, the next task was to visit the bank. Isaac accompanied Delilah, his hand never straying far from his gun. The streets of Belmont seemed different in the harsh light of day. Faces that had been merely curious yesterday now looked suspicious or hostile. At the bank, they were met with resistance. The teller, Mr. Collins, refused to accept Delilah's tax payment without the manager's approval. The manager, conveniently, was out for the morning. "This is ridiculous," Delilah said after they'd been waiting for an hour. "The taxes are due today. If I don't pay, they'll have grounds to seize the property." "That's the idea," Isaac muttered. He glanced around the bank, noting the absence of guards. "Wait here." Before Delilah could protest, Isaac strode behind the counter, ignoring the teller's sputtering objections, and knocked on the manager's office door. Without waiting for a response, he opened it to find the manager sitting at his desk, very much present. "Mr. Harrington," the man exclaimed, rising quickly. "This area is off-limits to customers. Funny, your teller said you were out." Isaac gestured for Delilah to join him. "Miss Hayes has a tax payment to make. I suggest you accept it promptly, unless you'd like the Territorial Banking Commission to hear about your selective service policies." The manager blanched. "There's no need for threats. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Isaac replied coldly, "is your belief that you can participate in the sheriff's scheme without consequences." Under Isaac's unwavering stare, the manager processed Delilah's payment and provided a receipt. As they left, Isaac could feel the man's eyes boring into their backs. "That was risky," Delilah said once they were outside. "But thank you. At least now they can't take the boarding house for non-payment." "They'll find another way," Isaac warned. "We need to find out who really took that money." Their next stop was the newspaper office, where the editor, a thin man with ink-stained fingers named Harold Bennett, listened to their story with growing interest. "Corruption in the sheriff's office wouldn't be the first such story I've covered," Bennett said, scribbling notes. "But I'll need evidence before I can print anything." "What about the fire at Miss Hayes's boarding house?" Isaac asked. "Surely that's newsworthy." Bennett frowned. "First I'm hearing of it. Sheriff's office didn't report any disturbances last night." "Of course they didn't," Delilah said bitterly. They provided Bennett with all the details, including statements from the tenants who had witnessed the arson attempt. The editor promised to look into it, though he made no guarantees about what he could publish. "Truth is, Sheriff Rawlings has powerful friends," Bennett admitted. "And I have a family to feed. All we're asking is that you help us get the truth out," Isaac said. "Sometimes that's all it takes to start changing things." As they left the newspaper office, Isaac noticed a man watching them from across the street. He wore a deputy's badge, but Isaac didn't recognize him from the jailhouse the day before. "We're being followed," he murmured to Delilah. "That's Deputy Owens," she replied quietly. "He's new, came to town about 3 months ago with Sheriff Rawlings' brother-in-law, Mr. Blackburn." "Blackburn, the one who wants your property?" Delilah nodded. "He owns the saloon and the mercantile already. Rumor has it he's buying up properties along Main Street in anticipation of the railroad. Isaac considered this information. We need to find out more about Blackburn and his connection to the sheriff. And about this missing money if it ever existed at all. They spent the afternoon gathering information, speaking discreetly with townspeople who might be sympathetic to Delilah's situation. Many were reluctant to talk, but a few provided useful insights. The elderly proprietor of the feed store, Mr. Jensen, was particularly helpful. Blackburn and Rawlings have been running this town like their private kingdom since they arrived, he confided. Started small pressuring businesses for protection money, intimidating competitors. But lately, they've gotten bolder. Have they framed others for crimes? Isaac asked. Jensen nodded grimly. The Wilsons lost their farm 2 months ago. Sheriff claimed Mr. Wilson was running an illegal still. Never found any evidence, but that didn't matter. They couldn't afford a lawyer, so they had to sell to Blackburn. Naturally, for a fraction of its worth. As they left the feed store, Isaac noticed Deputy Owens was still following them, not even attempting to be discreet. We're going to have company all day, he muttered. Let them watch, Delilah said with determination. We're not doing anything wrong. They returned to the boarding house to find Mrs. Abernathy in a state of agitation. There was a man asking questions while you were gone, she reported. Said he was from the bank checking on property values. But he was looking at everything too closely, the furniture, the kitchen, even asked about the cellar. What did he look like? Isaac asked sharply. Tall, well-dressed. Had a scar on his right cheek. Mrs. Abernathy wrung her hands. I didn't like the way he smiled like a cat that's cornered a mouse. Blackburn, Delilah said, her face paling. He's never come here himself before. Isaac's expression hardened. They're getting impatient. The tax play failed, so they'll try something else. We should go to the territorial marshal, Mrs. Abernathy suggested. Surely he would help. The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride, Delilah reminded her. And we have no guarantee he's not in Blackburn's pocket too. Isaac paced the room, considering their options. We need leverage, something that would expose their operation so thoroughly that even their friends couldn't protect them. Delilah suddenly straightened. The ledger. What ledger? Isaac stopped pacing to look at her. Mr. Fletcher kept detailed records of everything that happened in town, who owned what property, who sold to whom, and for how much. He was a bit of a town historian. Delilah's eyes brightened with realization. He mentioned once that he documented some suspicious transactions involving the previous sheriff, how certain properties changed hands for far less than they were worth. Where is this ledger? Isaac asked. In the cellar. Mr. Fletcher had a hidden compartment built into the wall. Delilah was already moving toward the cellar door. I'd forgotten all about it until now. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserves. Delilah lit a lantern and led Isaac to the far wall, where shelves held jars of canned fruits and vegetables. Here, she said, pushing aside several jars to reveal a small lever disguised as a knot in the wooden shelving. When she pulled it, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small cavity. Inside was a leather-bound book, thick with years of entries. Delilah pulled it out reverently. This might have the evidence we need. They brought the ledger upstairs and spent the next hour poring over its contents. Charles Fletcher had indeed been meticulous, documenting not only property transactions but also notes about suspicious activities, conflicts of interest, and rumors of corruption. Look at this, Isaac said, pointing to an entry from 6 months ago. Fletcher suspected Blackburn was working with someone at the bank to manipulate property assessments. And here he flipped forward several pages. He names names. Collins, the teller, and Judge Harmon, who approves all foreclosures. Delilah's finger traced down to a more recent entry. This was written just before he died. He suspected the new sheriff was involved too. Said Rawlings and Blackburn had been seen meeting late at night at the saloon with a bank representative. Does he mention any proof? Documents? Witnesses? Isaac asked urgently. Delilah turned the page and gasped. Tucked between the pages was an envelope. Inside were several folded papers, bank documents showing irregular transfers, a list of properties targeted for acquisition, and most damning of all, a contract between Blackburn and the railroad company, dated months before the public announcement of the rail spur. Insider information, Isaac said grimly. They knew the railroad was coming before anyone else, which let them buy up properties cheap before values soared. But why would Mr. Fletcher keep this hidden instead of exposing them? Mrs. Abernathy asked, having joined them at the table. Delilah's expression grew sad. He was dying, and he had no one to trust with this information. She looked at the documents with new understanding. He left the boarding house to me to protect it, and he left these records hoping someday someone would use them. That day is today, Isaac declared, gathering the papers. We need to make copies of these immediately, then get the originals somewhere safe. Before they could act, however, the front door burst open. Sheriff Rawlings stood there with Deputy Owens and another man tall, expensively dressed, with a scar on his right cheek. Blackburn. Well, well, the sheriff drawled, his hand resting on his gun. Looks like we caught some thieves red-handed. Isaac moved protectively in front of Delilah. The only thieves here are wearing badges or buying them. Blackburn stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on the ledger and papers on the table. That's private property you're holding, Mr. Harrington. Property that belongs to the bank. Funny, Isaac replied, not backing down. It has Charles Fletcher's name on it, and he left everything to Miss Hayes. Not everything, Sheriff Rawlings countered. Those documents were stolen from the bank yesterday, the same time as the missing money. We have witnesses. Your witnesses are as false as your badge, Delilah said, her voice steady despite her fear. The sheriff's face darkened. That's enough out of you. You're both under arrest for theft, conspiracy, and now for threatening an officer of the law. We haven't threatened anyone, Isaac said calmly. But I'm making a promise now. Touch either of us, and these documents will find their way to every newspaper in the territory and to the governor's office. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Blackburn's face. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Documents can be destroyed, and accidents happen to prisoners all the time. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Isaac's hand moved slowly toward his gun, calculating whether he could draw fast enough to take down both lawmen before they could react. Before the situation could escalate further, a new voice entered the fray. That's quite enough, gentlemen. Everyone turned to see Attorney Prescott standing in the doorway, accompanied by an older man wearing a marshal's badge. Marshal Thompson, Sheriff Rawlings said, his confidence faltering slightly. What brings you to Belmont? Serious allegations of corruption, Sheriff? The marshal replied, stepping into the room. Mr. Prescott here has been gathering evidence for months. We were just missing the final pieces. His gaze fell on the documents on the table, which it seems Miss Hayes has provided. Blackburn's hand moved toward his coat, but Marshal Thompson was quicker. I wouldn't, Mr. Blackburn. My deputies are positioned outside, and they have orders to come in shooting if they hear trouble. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring for several seconds before Sheriff Rawlings slowly raised his hands. This is a misunderstanding, Marshal. We were investigating stolen bank property. Save it for the judge, Marshal Thompson replied. A judge from the territorial capital, not your friend Harmon. He gestured to his deputies, who had appeared behind him. Take them into custody. As the lawmen were being disarmed and handcuffed, Isaac kept his position in front of Delilah, unwilling to trust the situation until the danger was completely past. "It's over," Prescott said, approaching them. "We've been building this case for months, but we needed concrete evidence tying them all together. When you mentioned Fletcher's ledger at the newspaper office, Editor Bennett sent word to me immediately." "Bennett was working with you?" Delilah asked in surprise. "Many in town have been waiting for a chance to break Blackburn's hold," Prescott explained. "But we needed someone from outside to catalyze action." He nodded respectfully to Isaac. "Your arrival was fortuitous, Mr. Harrington." As the marshal's deputies led Rawlings, Owens, and Blackburn away, the tension in the room finally broke. Mrs. Abernathy excused herself to prepare tea, leaving Isaac, Delilah, and Prescott to discuss the next steps. "The territorial court will want statements from both of you," Prescott said, "and the ledger and documents will need to be entered as evidence." Delilah nodded, looking somewhat dazed by the sudden turn of events. "What about the boarding house and the other properties they've stolen?" "Justice takes time," Prescott admitted. "But with this evidence, I believe many of the fraudulent transactions can be reversed. Your boarding house, at least, is secure." After Prescott left to assist the marshal, Delilah and Isaac found themselves alone in the parlor. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, and the events of the past 2 days seemed to catch up with them all at once. "I don't know how to thank you," Delilah said softly. "You risked everything for someone you didn't even know." Isaac shook his head. "You're the brave one. You stood up to them despite everything they threw at you." Their eyes met, and Isaac felt something shift between them, a connection deeper than gratitude or shared danger. In the space of 2 days, Delilah Hayes had awakened something in him that he thought had died years ago on the battlefields of the war. "Hope. What will you do now?" Delilah asked, breaking the moment. Isaac considered the question. He'd been drifting for so long, he hardly knew what it meant to stay in one place. "I came to Belmont looking for work," he said slowly. "Seems like I found it, just not the kind I expected." "There's always work at a boarding house," Delilah offered tentatively. "The roof needs repairs, and after last night's fire, the kitchen will need renovation." It was an invitation not just to work, but to stay, to begin building something permanent. Isaac looked around the parlor with its worn but comfortable furniture, felt the warmth of the house around him, and realized he'd found something he hadn't been looking for. "I'd like that," he said simply. In the days that followed, Belmont began to change. With Blackburn and Rawlings awaiting trial in the territorial capital, the townspeople slowly emerged from under the shadow of their corruption. Properties that had been fraudulently seized were returned to their rightful owners. The bank underwent an audit, resulting in the dismissal of several employees complicit in the scheme. Isaac stayed true to his word, beginning repairs on the boarding house. The work gave him purpose, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. Each day brought him and Delilah closer, their friendship deepening as they shared meals, conversations, and the gradual restoration of the boarding house. The kitchen was the first priority. Together, they stripped away the fire-damaged portions and rebuilt them, making improvements along the way. Isaac found that he enjoyed working with his hands, creating something lasting instead of destroying. "You're good at this," Delilah remarked one afternoon as they installed new cabinets. "Where did you learn carpentry?" "My father was a carpenter back in Pennsylvania," Isaac replied, measuring a board. "I worked alongside him until the war called me away." The memory was bittersweet. His father had passed while Isaac was fighting, another tie to home severed. "He taught you well," Delilah said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in understanding. The simple contact sent warmth through him, and Isaac found himself sharing more about his past, the family he'd lost, the years of wandering, the ghosts he'd been trying to outrun. Delilah listened without judgment, offering her own stories. In return, her dreams of education cut short by her parents' deaths, her determination to make her own way in a world that often undervalued women's independence. As summer turned to fall, the boarding house thrived under their joint care. New tenants arrived, drawn by Delilah's fair prices and the improved accommodations. Isaac's role evolved from temporary handyman to permanent partner in the business, his room moving from the parlor sofa to a proper bedroom on the second floor. Yet there remained an unspoken tension between them, a current of feeling neither had put into words. Isaac found himself watching Delilah when she wasn't looking, the graceful way she moved, the kindness she showed to every tenant, the fierce intelligence that had helped her survive in a hostile world. And sometimes he caught her watching him too, a blush coloring her cheeks when their eyes met. The trial of Blackburn, Rawlings, and their accomplices was scheduled for November. As key witnesses, Isaac and Delilah prepared to travel to Cheyenne to testify. The night before their departure, they sat together in the parlor after the other tenants had retired, discussing the journey ahead. "Are you nervous?" Isaac asked, noticing the way Delilah's fingers fidgeted with her shawl. "A little," she admitted. "Not about testifying. I've rehearsed my statement with Mr. Prescott until I could recite it in my sleep. But about leaving the boarding house." She smiled ruefully. "I haven't been away from it since I inherited it. Mrs. Abernathy will keep everything running smoothly," Isaac reassured her, "and will only be gone a week or so." Delilah nodded, her gaze drifting to the fire. "It's strange. For so long, this house was all I had, my security, my future. But now," she looked up, meeting his eyes, "now I'm beginning to think there might be more to life than just these walls." The implication hung in the air between them. Isaac felt his heart quicken. "Delilah." A loud knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Isaac rose, hand instinctively moving to the gun he still wore, and answered the door cautiously. A young boy stood there, breathless from running. "Mr. Harrington? Mr. Prescott sent me. There's been a change of plans. The marshal needs you and Miss Hayes to leave tonight. One of Blackburn's men escaped custody and was seen heading this way." Isaac's protective instincts flared immediately. "Where's the marshal now?" "Waiting at the stagecoach office with an escort," the boy replied. "He says to pack only what you need and come right away." After the boy left, Isaac turned to Delilah. "We need to go. I don't like the idea of Blackburn's men anywhere near you." Delilah was already moving toward the stairs. "I'll be ready in 10 minutes. They packed quickly, taking only essentials and the precious ledger and documents that would be presented as evidence. After leaving instructions with Mrs. Abernathy and securing the house, they made their way through the darkened streets to the stagecoach office. Marshal Thompson met them with 2 deputies, all heavily armed. "Sorry for the late change of plans," he said gruffly, "but we received intelligence that suggests Blackburn still has loyal men willing to prevent your testimony by any means necessary." The stagecoach was ready, its team of horses stamping impatiently in the cold night air. Isaac helped Delilah aboard, then climbed in after her. The marshal and 1 deputy joined them, while the 2nd deputy took a position on top with the driver. As the stagecoach pulled away from Belmont, Delilah gazed out the window at the receding lights of the town. "I wonder if it will look different when we return," she mused. "Towns have a way of changing after justice has been served," Marshal Thompson remarked. "People walk a little taller, speak a little freer." The journey to Cheyenne was long and occasionally tense. Twice, the marshal ordered detours to avoid areas where he suspected ambushes might be waiting. Isaac remained vigilant throughout, his body positioned protectively near Delilah, his senses alert for any signs of danger. On the second night, they stopped at a small way station to change horses and rest briefly. While the marshal conferred with the station manager, Isaac and Delilah stepped outside for fresh air. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Wyoming sky. Away from town lights, the Milky Way stretched in a luminous band overhead. Isaac found himself stealing glances at Delilah, her face upturned to the heavens, starlight reflecting in her eyes. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. "Yes," he replied, not looking at the stars. Delilah turned and caught his gaze. For a moment, they stood perfectly still, the cold night air around them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with a courage born of facing much greater fears, Isaac stepped forward and took her hands in his. "Delilah, I need to say something before we reach Cheyenne and get caught up in the trial." He took a deep breath. "I came to Belmont with no intention of staying. I'd been running so long, I'd forgotten how to stand still. But then I saw you, and something changed. You reminded me that there are things worth fighting for, worth staying for." Her hands tightened around his. "Isaac, let me finish," he said gently. "I don't have much to offer. I'm a man with a troubled past and few possessions to my name. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay not just as your handyman or business partner, but as something more. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you in the street that day." Delilah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I thought I was content with my independence," she whispered. "I'd convinced myself that was all I needed. But these past months with you have shown me what I've been missing." She reached up to touch his face. "I love you too, Isaac Harrington. And yes, I'll have you troubled past, few possessions and all." Under the vast Wyoming sky, with the distant howl of coyotes as their only witnesses, Isaac pulled Delilah close and kissed her. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of homes found rather than built, of futures waiting to be written together. Their moment was interrupted by Marshal Thompson clearing his throat. "Time to move on," he said, though his weathered face held a hint of a smile. "Save the courting for after the trial, if you please." The remainder of the journey passed quickly, the stagecoach arriving in Cheyenne without incident. The territorial capital was larger and more bustling than Belmont, with brick buildings, proper sidewalks, and gas streetlights illuminating the main thoroughfares. They were escorted to a hotel near the courthouse where they would be staying under guard until the trial began. After weeks of preparation and anticipation, the proceedings themselves were almost anticlimactic. The evidence against Blackburn, Rawlings, and their associates was overwhelming. Charles Fletcher's meticulously kept records, combined with testimony from dozens of witnesses from Belmont and surrounding communities, painted a clear picture of systematic corruption and abuse of power. Isaac and Delilah both testified, recounting the events that had led to the discovery of Fletcher's hidden documents. Under the skilled questioning of the territorial prosecutor, they described the threats, intimidation, and attempts at framing that had been used to try to separate Delilah from her property. Throughout the trial, Isaac remained by Delilah's side, a steady presence as she faced her accusers. The courtroom was tense, especially when Blackburn took the stand in his own defense, his cold eyes fixed on Delilah with undisguised hatred. But justice prevailed. After deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Blackburn and Rawlings were sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, while their accomplices received lesser sentences based on their level of involvement. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Delilah breathed deeply of the crisp December air. "It's really over," she said with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "A new beginning," Isaac corrected gently, taking her hand. "For Belmont and for us." Their return to Belmont was met with celebration. The townspeople gathered at the railway station to welcome them, many expressing gratitude for their courage in standing up to the corruption that had plagued their community. Mrs. Abernathy had organized a welcome dinner at the boarding house, inviting neighbors and tenants to share in the homecoming. As life settled back into a rhythm, Isaac and Delilah found themselves discussing the future. With the boarding house secure and prospering, they began to make plans not just for the business, but for their life together. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the boarding house decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, Isaac proposed properly. He'd saved enough to buy a small gold ring with a single pearl modest, but given with all the love in his heart. "I want to build a life with you, Delilah," he said, kneeling before her in the parlor after the other residents had retired for the night. "Not just as business partners, but as husband and wife. Will you marry me?" Delilah's answer was immediate and heartfelt. "Yes, Isaac. 1,000 times, yes." They were married in the spring of 1879, as the plains burst into bloom after the long winter. The ceremony took place in Belmont's small church, with the entire town turning out to witness the union of the woman who had stood her ground against corruption and the drifter who had found a home in her courage. Mrs. Abernathy, who had become like family to them both, wept openly during the vows. Attorney Prescott served as Isaac's best man, while Sarah Abernathy stood as Delilah's maid of honor. Even Marshall Thompson made the journey from Cheyenne to attend, presenting them with a finely crafted clock as a wedding gift. "To remind you," he said with unusual sentimentality, "that the time we're given is precious. Use it wisely together." Over the next year, Isaac and Delilah expanded the boarding house, adding a new wing with additional rooms to accommodate Belmont's growing population. The railroad spur that Blackburn had schemed to profit from was completed, bringing new businesses and residents to town. Instead of falling victim to corruption, the community flourished under honest leadership. In the summer of 1880, Delilah gave birth to their first child, a son they named Charles Fletcher Harrington, in honor of the man whose foresight had brought them together. Isaac, who had once been unable to imagine settling anywhere, found himself completely at home in the role of husband, father, and respected businessman. The ledger that had exposed Blackburn's crimes took on a new purpose. Isaac and Delilah continued Charles Fletcher's tradition of recording Belmont's history, documenting the town's growth and transformation in the wake of the corruption scandal. It became a family record as well, with notations of their marriage, their son's birth, and the small daily joys that made up their life together. 5 years after their wedding, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching their son play in the yard with their 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth, Delilah turned to Isaac with a reflective smile. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "When the sheriff was dragging me through town, and you threatened to burn Belmont down if he didn't untie me?" Isaac chuckled, taking her hand in his. The years of working on the boarding house had left calluses on his once smooth hands, badges of honor from a life well lived. "I think about it often. Best threat I never had to carry out." "Would you have done it?" she asked curiously. "Burned the town down?" Isaac considered the question seriously. "For you, I would have moved heaven and earth." He squeezed her hand. "But I'm glad it didn't come to that. This town's become home in a way no place ever has before." Delilah leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as Charles helped his little sister up after a tumble. "When I was a girl, I used to dream of adventure, traveling the world, seeing grand places. I never imagined that the greatest adventure would be building a life in one spot, with one person." "Disappointed?" Isaac teased gently. "Not for a moment," she replied with conviction. "Every day with you is an adventure, Isaac Harrington, and I wouldn't trade our life for all the travels in the world." As twilight descended on Belmont, painting the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, Isaac reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a rootless drifter haunted by war to a man surrounded by love and purpose, his path had been unexpected but perfect in its way. The sheriff had dragged her through town, and he had made a desperate threat that day. But from that moment of chaos and injustice had sprung a love that had not only saved Delilah, but had saved him as well, a love that had given them both the greatest gift of all, a place to belong together. 10 years after the events that brought them together, Belmont had grown into a prosperous town of nearly 2,000 souls. The Harrington boarding house, as it was now known, had expanded again to include a separate family residence attached to the main building. Isaac and Delilah managed the business together while raising their 3 children. Charles, now 10, Elizabeth, 8, and James, their youngest at 4. The story of how they met had become something of a local legend, embellished with each retelling until Isaac sometimes joked that according to town lore, he'd single-handedly faced down an army to rescue Delilah. The truth is impressive enough, Delilah would remind him with a smile. You stood against corruption when no one else would. That took more courage than any gunfight. Isaac had never quite grown comfortable with being called a hero, but he'd found peace with his past. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years after the war had been replaced by the steady rhythms of family life and community involvement. He served on Belmont's town council, helping to ensure that the corruption of the Blackburn era never returned. Delilah, meanwhile, had fulfilled her interrupted dream of education by establishing a small library in one of the boarding house's common rooms. What began as a collection of her own books grew as residents donated volumes and funds for new acquisitions. She organized reading groups for children and literacy classes for adults, becoming as well known for her educational contributions as for her role in exposing Belmont's former corruption. On a warm September day in 1889, as they prepared for the boarding house's annual harvest celebration, a letter arrived that would stir memories of the past. The territorial governor was coming to Belmont as part of a tour before Wyoming's anticipated statehood, and he requested a meeting with the Harringtons. What do you suppose he wants? Delilah asked as they sat on their porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Isaac shrugged. Perhaps just to meet the famous couple who helped clean up Belmont. Or maybe he's interested in your library initiative. The governor arrived 3 days later with minimal fanfare, declining the town's offer of a formal reception in favor of a private meeting at the Harrington home. He was a dignified man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and a straightforward manner that both Isaac and Delilah appreciated. I've heard much about you two over the years, Governor Warren said as they sat in the parlor after dinner. Your actions set a precedent that has helped us address corruption in several other communities across the territory. We only did what was necessary, Isaac replied modestly. The governor smiled. Necessity is the mother of courage, they say. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. But I didn't come just to express gratitude. I have a proposal for you both. He explained that with statehood on the horizon, Wyoming was seeking to establish stronger judicial and law enforcement systems. The governor was creating a special commission to review past cases of corruption and to recommend reforms for the future. I would like you both to serve on this commission, he said. Your experience with the Blackburn affair and your continued commitment to this community make you uniquely qualified. Isaac and Delilah exchanged surprised glances. The request was unexpected and would require time away from the boarding house and their children. We're honored, Delilah said carefully, but our responsibilities here, I understand completely. The governor interjected. The commission would meet quarterly in Cheyenne, 3 days at most each session. Your insights would be invaluable, but I respect your priorities. Could we have some time to consider? Isaac asked. Of course. The first meeting isn't scheduled until after the new year. After the governor departed, Isaac and Delilah discussed the proposal late into the night. There were practical considerations: the boarding house's management during their absences, arrangements for the children, but also deeper questions about their responsibility to the wider community. What we experienced with Blackburn and Rawlings isn't unique, Delilah said thoughtfully. If our knowledge could help prevent similar abuses elsewhere, it's an opportunity to extend the change we started here, Isaac agreed. But you and the children come first. If you feel it's too much, we built this life together, Delilah reminded him, taking his hand. And our children should see that standing for justice doesn't end when your own battle is won. I think we should accept. And so, as Wyoming prepared for statehood, Isaac and Delilah Harrington added a new chapter to their story. For times a year, they traveled to Cheyenne, leaving the boarding house in Mrs. Abernathy's capable hands, though she was now Mrs. Jensen, having married the feed store owner 5 years prior. Their work on the commission proved significant. Their first-hand experience with corruption provided practical insights that helped shape Wyoming's new judicial ethics standards. Delilah's detailed records, begun in Charles Fletcher's tradition, became a template for transparency requirements in local government. Life continued to evolve in Belmont as well. Charles, their eldest, showed a keen interest in law, inspired by his parents' involvement in the commission. Elizabeth inherited her mother's love of books and teaching, while young James seemed destined to follow his father's practical skills, always eager to help with repairs around the boarding house. In July 1890, Wyoming officially became the 44th state, and the Harringtons attended the celebration in Cheyenne as honored guests. As they watched the new state flag being raised, Isaac felt a sense of pride not just in Wyoming's progress but in their family's small part in its journey. "Did you ever imagine," he whispered to Delilah as they stood among the cheering crowd, "that the day I threatened to burn down Belmont would lead to this?" She squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "I imagined nothing beyond surviving that day. But you gave me more than rescue, Isaac. You gave me a partner to build a future with. That future continued to unfold in unexpected and rewarding ways." The boarding house evolved into a proper hotel as Belmont grew, while still maintaining the personal touch that had been its hallmark. Charles, after studying law in Cheyenne, returned to establish Belmont's first proper law practice. Elizabeth became the town schoolteacher, eventually founding a women's educational society that championed advanced learning opportunities. Young James, to everyone's surprise, developed an interest in photography, documenting Belmont's growth and his family's history through a new medium. His photographs of the old boarding house, the expanding town, and his aging parents became treasured family heirlooms. As Isaac and Delilah entered their later years, they gradually stepped back from the daily management of the hotel, entrusting it to capable hands while remaining involved as advisors. Their home, built adjacent to the original boarding house, became a gathering place for family, friends, and occasionally young couples seeking advice from those whose love story had become legendary in the region. In 1913, 35 years after the day the sheriff had dragged Delilah through town, they celebrated their wedding anniversary with a gathering that included not just their children and 7 grandchildren, but many of Belmont's oldest residents, people who remembered the town's darkest days and its subsequent renewal. At 88, Mrs. Jensen, formerly Abernathy, was still sharp-minded enough to recount to the younger generations how she had witnessed the confrontation between Isaac and Sheriff Rawlings. "You should have seen him," she told the wide-eyed grandchildren, "standing there like an avenging angel, telling that corrupt sheriff he'd burn the town down if he didn't untie your grandmother." Isaac, now in his late 60s but still straight-backed and clear-eyed, chuckled at her embellishment. "It wasn't quite that dramatic." "It was exactly that dramatic," Delilah corrected with a smile, her hand finding his as naturally as it had for decades. Though silver had replaced the auburn in her hair, her eyes still held the same strength and intelligence that had captured his heart. That night, after the celebration had ended and their guests had departed, Isaac and Delilah sat alone on their porch as they had done countless evenings before. The town of Belmont spread below them, its streets now lit by electric lights, its businesses and homes extending far beyond the boundaries of the settlement they had known in 1878. "It's been a good life, hasn't it?" Delilah mused, her head resting against his shoulder. "The best," Isaac replied simply, his arm around her. "Better than I ever deserved or imagined." "I disagree," she said with the gentle stubbornness that had never diminished. "You deserved every happiness, Isaac Harrington. From the moment you stood up for a stranger because it was right, you deserved a life filled with love. Then I'm fortunate beyond measure that you were the one to give it to me," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss on the journey to Cheyenne, the same eternal lights that had shone down on generations of love stories before theirs and would illuminate countless more to come. The sheriff had dragged her through town. The cowboy had made his stand. And from that moment of courage had blossomed a love that transformed not just two lives, but an entire community, a legacy of justice, compassion, and unwavering devotion that would endure long after they were gone. Their story, begun in conflict and sealed with a promise, had become something neither could have foreseen. Not just a personal happiness, but a testament to the power of standing firm against injustice and building something beautiful in the space where fear once ruled. As night deepened around them, Delilah and Isaac Harrington remained on their porch, hand in hand, their hearts as connected in their 68th year together as they had been on that fateful day when a desperate threat had sparked an enduring love, a love that had not burned Belmont down, but had instead helped it rise, renewed and stronger than before.